All right, so in this video, we'll proceed talking about functions. And now we are going to talk about return types. We can actually return things from our functions. Okay, let's go ahead and comment this out there. So save that. Let's get rid of, okay, this is all good. Return types. So we're going to go ahead and do the same thing. Let's create a function here. Let's call this func. We're going to call add numbers. I want this function here to have two arguments of type integers. So we're going to say here, first num is type int, second num is also of type int. And then we are going to go ahead and close. In order for us to tell the compiler that this function here needs to return a type, we go say dash greater than sign, shift, and then the period key. There it is. And we can go ahead and say int. And only then we put the braces there. Let's take a quick look here at what's happening here. So we created our function. We say func. We name it add numbers. We open parentheses because that means we are creating a function. And then inside we're passing in first num of type int, second num of type int. And when we close our parentheses, and then we have this dash and greater than sign, and then we put int. Now this int here means this is the return type for this method here. Now we notice right away we have an error here, so click on that. Missing return in function, expected to return in integers. That's one thing about having this return type here, because now the system is saying, well, you told me that I need to return an int type, yet you're not returning anything here. So to finalize the contract we are making here by saying this returns an int, we actually have to say return something. Say enter. In this case, what we need to do, we want to return, for now, just put 0 here so that we don't have that error. But in reality, we want to return these two numbers we are passing in as arguments. Let's go ahead and say let sum equal to first num plus second num. So we are saying we are creating a variable called sum, and then we are saying this sum is going to be equal to first num plus second num. So we're adding these two numbers here and put into our variable called sum. Then we are able then to take this sum here and return a sum, right? Very simple. We want to print out, if we want to actually see this in action, what we do, we go ahead and say print. And then inside here, we can just go ahead and say this sum is, and then let's go append our add numbers. And of course, we pass in, let's say pass in 3. And then remember, the second has to be labeled. So the second argument needs to be labeled. So say second num colon, and let's see 5. And you can see right away, the sum is 8. So 3 and 5 is 8. Now what we wrote here, it works, but it's a little bit cluttered. So it's always a good idea. I like to put things in variables. So what we can do here, we can just say let final sum be equal to add num. So I'm going to call the method here. Well, it tells me right away that add numbers requires first num and second num. If you recall correctly, you've seen this before when we were coding our applications, where we would invoke certain functions and then this would happen. Code guessing here. All right, great. So now let's go ahead and pass in, let's say 4. And then for the second, let's pass in 5. And here, now this final sum here is holding the result which we are getting from our method here. Okay, so now we can use this final sum and copy this and just pass inside here, Ctrl V, and we're gonna get the same result. We could have left as it was, but this is more visually more appealing because you can then understand what's exactly is happening here. The beauty of returning something is that as we return the sum here, we can take that sum and put it in a different variable and then use that variable and then display. And if we wanted to, okay, this is the beauty. I'm just showing different things we can do. Since we are returning a number, because we said it's an integer, we can even add here. We can say if we want to add 10, for instance, let's look what's going to happen. 19, right? Because now we're saying the add numbers, which returns 9 in this case here, Once it returns 9, we want to add 10 to it. And guess what? Final number is saying 19 because now 4 plus 5 is 9 plus 10 is 19. And you can keep adding 6 to 7, for instance, and so forth. That's great. And obviously, you can go ahead and put many other arguments here, as many as you need. But it's always a good idea to put minimal number of arguments because you don't want to end up having 30 arguments and it just gets a little bit verbose and a little bit confusing. But, you know, there will be times you probably need 5, 4, 5, or 6. That's fine. As a little challenge for you, go ahead and create 2 functions. One will subtract numbers, 2 numbers, just like we did here. The second one would multiply 2 numbers. All right, I hope you manage it. So essentially, you will do the same thing, all right? So you would go ahead and create something like, for instance, you can say func, and you can say subtract numbers, right? And go ahead and you can go ahead even say first number, first num, int, second num, type int, and make sure you are returning the integer, of course. And here, let's go ahead, I'm going to copy this and pass there in. And instead of sum, I can say result, first number minus second number, and return result. You can go ahead here and say let final res for result be equal to subtract first number. I'm going to say 8. Second number, I'm going to say 6, right? And then I'm going to say print. I'm going to go ahead and say result is, and I'm going to pass in the final res. And there it is. Result is 2 because 8 minus 6 is indeed 2. All right, so very simple, nothing too complicated. And I'm sure you were able to also do the same with divide and multiply. Wonderful, great. So let me go ahead and put this at the bottom here so that we can go ahead and proceed. I'm going to go ahead and comment this out so we don't have it distracting us. The other thing I would like to point out here, you may look at here and say, well, because here we have first num as int and second number as int, that therefore we can only return an int. That's not necessarily true. I will show you why that's not true. Let's create this very simple function. Say func, we're going to call this char numbers. In this function here, we are going to pass in a string. So we're going to say my string of type string, and we want to return an int. So what we're going to do, we're going to pass in a string, and then we're going to return how many characters are in our strings, right? So what we can do now here, we can go ahead and say return. For now, let's say return 0, so we don't have that error. And now we can say here, char count be equal. Now we're going to go ahead and get this my string here we're passing in. Say my string dot characters, and then we say dot count. So now this char count here has the count or the number of characters in our string that we're passing in here. So now we can go ahead and just return a char count, right? So as you can see, our argument here is actually a string, but it's returning an integer. So now we can go ahead and say print. Let's see, we can go ahead and let's say char numbers. Let's pass in a string here. Let's say hello. Look what's going to happen. 5. Because hello has 5 characters, right? So 1 character, H-E-L-L-O. So 5 characters. You can say here jobs. Let's go 4. Life, 4 as well. Light, as you can see here, should be 5. Okay, so this was, I just wanted to point out that, you know, you could have inferred from our previous example here that since we have integers all across in our arguments, then of course it has to return an integer. That's true, but that doesn't necessarily mean every time we have an integer here or any other type, that doesn't mean it has to match with what we're returning. In most cases, probably yes, but as you can see here, we are returning an int even though we are indeed passing in arguments here as a string. Okay, that's great. All right, so I'll see you in the next video.